Jonathan Barry is a student in the School of Social Work, studying the impact of trauma on individual and community development. He is passionate about working to prevent sexual violence and also working with fathers to promote nurturing relationships in families. He has two younger sisters, Marie and Olivia, who he is very proud of. Please welcome Jonathan.
Thank you. So, as I start, I'd like you all to take a moment and bring to mind a man in your life. Somebody who is important to you and someone you're close to. Notice the emotions that come up. And ask yourself, what is your deepest wish for this person? As you think about what you wish, how do you feel? As I talk, I invite you to hold this person and this feeling in your heart and your mind. Now, over the last several years, I've worked on this campus to prevent and end male violence. And I hope to share some of my experiences and perspectives about that work with you today. I attended BC as an undergrad and am back now as a grad student in the School of Social Work. I'm a co-founder of a mixed-gender weekly discussion group on themes of masculinity called Man Up, which is where the talk gets its name. I feel deeply connected to the work of feminism, which I see, at least in part, as work to deconstruct social systems that encourage male violence. Now, I want to pause for a second and explain where I fit into this. And I want to share an important memory about my time as an undergrad. I was coming back my freshman year at BC over holiday break. And at that time, I had been dating someone for about a year and a half. She was my high school sweetheart. I loved her. And she probably knew me better than any other person in the world. And she said to me, "John, I think BC is making you a worse person." She said, "I think BC is making you a worse person." Now that really shook me. And it forced me to think about how BC was shaping my personal growth. And reflecting on this experience, I don't think BC is entirely to blame, but I do think my experience is connected to a serious social problem, and perhaps this problem was magnified in the culture at BC. Whether you want to label it as bro culture or J. Crew with a hangover, there are certain things about the dominant culture on this campus that influence my behavior in negative ways. However, it was reflecting on these negative experiences that has given me some clues about why feminism in particular could be valuable to men in helping them to avoid the experiences that I had. Now, in talking about men and feminism, it's not my intention to take away the important role that feminism and feminist spaces play in empowering women, girls, and transgender folks. I think it's important that feminism and feminist spaces exist primarily for them. However, as a man, I also think it's important for men to have space to talk about their relationship to the dominant culture, because even though men benefit from investing in dominant cultural norms, we're also harmed by it in complex ways that are different for every man. But the thing is, men don't often talk about this. And while men's experiences are different and unique, acknowledging negative impact that dominant cultural norms and masculinity have on men can be a doorway into conversations with men about why feminism can be liberating. In the remainder of my talk, I'd like to share some information and strategies of my work with men over the years. I want to touch on 4 themes: conformity to norms of masculinity, health, mental health, and violence. Now first, when I talk about conformity to norms of masculinity, I want to be clear about what I mean. Conformity to norms of masculinity means the attachment that men and people of all genders have to the social rules about men should behave. And while the shape these rules take depends heavily on culture and context, one thing that research seems to indicate about social norms of masculinity is that the quality of a man's relationship to these social norms affects his well-being. A relationship to social norms and masculinity that is adaptable and flexible is healthier than when social norms dictate behavior. Another important point uncovered in research is that men's attachment to social norms is highly influenced by how men perceive what other people, and particularly what other men, might expect of them. This is an important point that I'll come back to later. But I'd like to get into my second and third areas of focus, health and mental health. Now, men's attachment to norms and masculinity tends to correlate with men's health in 5 important ways. Men with more rigid attachment to norms and masculinity are more likely to have poorer health outcomes. They're less likely to engage in preventative health care. They're more likely to engage in health risk behaviors like substance abuse and coronary prone behavior, which can lead to heart disease. They're also less likely to reach out and ask for help when something's wrong. And finally, men with rigid attachments to norms of masculinity are more likely to die at a younger age. Now, research tells a similar story for men's mental health, and men with more rigid attachment to norms of masculinity are more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety, and tend to score lower on a number of measures that indicate mental well-being. Perhaps most strikingly, a study by BC professor Scott Easton indicates that men who are survivors of childhood sexual violence are more likely to commit suicide as adults if they have rigid attachments to norms of masculinity. Now, what this research about men's health seems to indicate is what feminists have long posited, that dominant norms of masculinity in our culture encourage violence. But normally when we think about men's violence in a feminist context, we think about men's violence against women. What I think we're seeing in this research on health and mental health is that dominant social norms of masculinity also encourage men to be violent towards themselves. Put another way, men are taught very narrowly defined ways of caring for themselves and other people. This brings me to my fourth point, violence. And it answers the question, why? I think it's very useful to talk about violence as a frame for looking at male behavior. As I've alluded to, it's possible to look at men's health and mental health from a frame of violence. But violence is pervasive in men's lives, even though most men simply take it for granted. What's key to understand is that men direct violence towards themselves and others in order to maintain power and status. And many men feel that if they're perceived as weak, they'll lose power and status. Now, there are lots of ways that men use violence, but I want to focus on one example, homophobia. And I think that's particularly important to talk about because of the space we're in. A Catholic university that has a long history of marginalizing folks from GLBT communities. Not to mention, if you've been a student on this campus, you've doubtlessly heard the phrase, "That's so gay," or "You're such a fag," or "No homo," countless times. These phrases and the threats of violence they're connected to are used as leverage and power over men. At BC, men who express their emotions, who don't hook up with the most women, who don't get wasted on the weekends, are derided as being gay and lose status in social hierarchy. From a different angle, homophobia has the side effect of limiting men's ability to form intimate and supportive relationships with each other. Because of homophobic violence, male relationships aren't safe spaces to be emotionally vulnerable. This is troubling because genuine and emotionally supportive relationships are the basis for supportive social networks, and strong social networks are the #1 protective factor for mental well-being of adults of all demographics and backgrounds. Now, to bring it back, I don't think feminism is wrong in identifying that men benefit and hold power in our culture, but in considering men's relationship to feminism, I think it's important to recognize that men's experience of power is inherently unstable and intertwined with fear and violence. Dominant cultural norms of masculinity encourage men to pursue power and status at the expense of their own well-being and the well-being of other people in their lives. This is why feminism is important to men. Now, in my own experience working with men on this campus, I found the best way to start conversations about these issues with men is by creating a safe space for men to share their experiences. And when I began this talk, I led you through an exercise of connecting with a positive intention for the men in your lives. Holding this intention is key to creating a safe space for men to share their experiences. However, spaces where these conversations happen are hard to find. The expectation is that men will get called out, and questioning norms of masculinity will diminish their status in social groups. This leads me back to the point I made earlier, that men's behavior is particularly influenced by how they see other men act. And men learn how to act through observing other men and listening to how other men talk about how they act. For this reason, male group spaces and the dynamics that emerge in them have tons of potential to influence male behavior. Unfortunately, since the broader culture encourages men to internalize violence as a way of relating to themselves and to other people, these spaces are not often safe spaces. So by creating explicitly safe spaces for men to come together, there's an opportunity to transform how men relate to each other, to themselves, and to other people in their lives. In my experience, working with men in these spaces, once they begin to have a genuine exchange with each other about masculinity, they quickly reach an agreement that most of the expectations that they set for male behavior are unrealistic nonsense and fantasy. Conversations like these are opportunities for men to unpack what they're taught about how they should act and judge if this fits with who they really are. There's space for men to heal from the violence they enact on themselves and the violence that's been acted upon them. Finally, these conversations are spaces for men to develop their capacity to form supportive, nurturing relationships that aren't based on violence. This healing work in group spaces with men is a critical first step to engaging men in feminist work to end male violence. Now, in closing, I'd like to reflect a little bit on my past 2 years' work in Man Up. Now, we call it Man Up for a reason. Because in our meetings, we hope to redefine what this phrase means. And we hope to redefine what norms of masculinity mean to us at BC. Now, whenever a new member comes to a meeting, we all go around and share why we're there. And a few months ago, someone shared something that really resonated with me. He said, I do a lot of things at BC to develop my mind. And I do a lot of things to develop my body. But I come to Man Up to nurture my soul. As an undergrad, I didn't have access to spaces like Man Up. So as a man in my work as a feminist, it's important for me to create these spaces for myself and for others so that they're able to have an experience at BC as more open, full, and loving human beings. And I believe that's what it really means to man up. Thank you.